Okay, so positioning, I'm going to group static and relative positioning together, okay? Static and relative positioning, you can categorize as in regular document flow. Okay, so if you apply static positioning you can actually almost think as the default position value that's applied to everything.
Should be fixed.
Okay, great. So I started.
That's cool.
Like 2 seconds ago. Relative positioning is the same. It's in document flow, and all other elements still recognize that that element is in document flow. Okay. Absolute and fixed are kind of the next group of elements. Okay. They kind of fall under the umbrella of absolute positioning, and absolute positioning I'll cover in a couple seconds. But absolute and fixed, you remove those elements from document flow, just like floats would be. So you float something, you give something absolute positioning or fixed positioning, you're removing it from document flow, and I'm going to show you some demos about what happens there. And the third kind of way to position things on your page is with floats, and we covered that last week. That was the hard one, so I thought if we got that out of the way, this might go much better. Okay, so like I said, this is regular document flow. Okay, these are block level elements. They're all stacking one on top of each other. They have no position properties applied to them yet. Right? So let's go ahead and apply a position property to element number 1. Okay. Jump back into Dreamweaver, if you're following along, and scroll down to where you see element 1. Okay, element 1 is just a class that I've applied to a div. Right? So I'm going to apply a new rule to this. I want to position this relative, and that's exactly how you write it. Just position relative. You could see when I type my semicolon there, all the different values popped up. So relative is the one that I want. Remember, relative is still in document flow. So if I save this and I preview it in my browser, refresh my page, nothing happened. Okay? Visually nothing happened. But what I've actually done behind the scenes is I've applied positioning to that first element. Okay? Now what I can do is I can actually start applying some offset values to this in order to move it on my screen. Okay? Relative to its position in document flow. I hope that makes sense. And when we start applying offsets, I hope that becomes clear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into Dreamweaver and give myself a new line break. And the 4 offset values that you can do are top, bottom, left, and right. They're pretty self-explanatory. Okay? So let's go ahead and we'll do top, and then you put in an actual measurement value. We'll do 10 pixels, just for easy math. And we'll do left, 10 pixels. If you guys have any questions at any point, shout. Okay? So go ahead and save that, and then test it in your browser again. Refresh your page. And you can see that element 1 moved a little bit. And you're wondering, okay, well, why did it move in that direction? Well, you moved it relative to its current position in document flow, which is why it's called relative positioning. Okay? It has its own place in document flow, and you want to move it based on that position. So why did it go down, and why did it go right? Because we said top 10 pixels and left 10 pixels. Well, what you're actually saying to the browser is, at the top edge of this element, move it 10 pixels. You're actually moving it down 10 pixels from the top of its original position. Okay? Same thing with left. Sorry, I'm trying to work backwards here because I'm looking at you. Go to the left edge and move it 10 pixels from the left, which actually moves it to the right. Okay? Does that make sense? So when you're doing this, you're really only going to ever apply 2 values, right? You wouldn't want to do top and then do bottom, right? You'd either be adding to your current position property or subtracting from it. Plus, it's just, you're not being very nice to your browser. You're asking it to do one thing and then do another thing, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? I'll refer to my notes really quick. So you're never ever going to use all 4 sides. You're never going to do top, bottom, left, and right. You're probably just going to do 1 or 2 of those offset values, whether it be top, bottom, left, or right. Okay? And remember, the point of origin, I guess, I'm doing air quotes again, the point of origin where it's moving it from is its original position in document flow. Okay, so I'm going to go back into Dreamweaver, and I'm going to change it from left 10 pixels to left negative 10 pixels. Does anybody have an idea of how else I could write that without using a negative value? Yeah, exactly. I could write right 10 pixels. It's the exact same thing. You can use negative values, however. So if I save that and go back out to my browser and refresh it, you can see that now it moved 20 pixels from where it was, but I'm now 10 pixels to the left from my relative position in document flow. All right, so let's go back into Dreamweaver. I want to change some of these values here. I'm going to give this a left of like 200 pixels and a top value of 100. Okay, I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back out to my browser and refresh the page. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense what just happened there. So it moved it 200 pixels from the left and 100 pixels from the top. However, you see something different happening here than what happened with the floats, is that usually when we floated something, everything else moved up to occupy this space. But what you have to remember is that all these elements, 2 and 3, still see this element in regular document flow. Relative positioning is still in document flow, okay? So it still recognizes it's there. It's not going to move up to occupy that space. I've never seen somebody try and design an entire website with relative positioning. The hard thing about relative positioning is that you have to know how everything else on the page is working, okay? If you were to ever have a change in content, let's say, and something, like a paragraph got longer or something, and you now needed to make a certain container bigger or move something, what happens if you move that one thing? You could end up affecting a whole bunch of other things, because with relative positioning, it's in document flow, everything can see each other and works in relation to each other, okay? So you would get totally lost in like positioningception if you were to do relative positioning for everything. It would just be completely ridiculous. I'm sure somebody's probably tried it as like a self-exercise or something, but that's why floats and clearing your floats is such a great tool. You can clear your floats and kind of restore document flow at a certain point, and then you have no worry about if content changes or not. Okay. So one more thing to help illustrate how all these element 2 and element 3 still see element 1, however they still see it right here in this spot, is I'm going to change the height on element 1. Okay, so pop back over to Dreamweaver, and let's give it a height, a height of 200 pixels. And so this height of 200 pixels, because of the cascade, it always adds the last rule that was applied is going to overwrite this height of 50 pixels that we applied previous. So if you go ahead and save that and then refresh that in your browser window, not only will you see element 1 get much taller, 200 pixels taller, or sorry, 150 pixels taller, you'll see elements 2 and 3 move down, thinking that, okay, that element is now 200 pixels, I need to make space for it. So if I hit refresh, yeah. So the page just got a lot longer. Okay, so you can see how confusing that would be if you were to use relative positioning for everything on your page. It would be just way too confusing. Does anybody have any questions about relative positioning? No? I would say, if I could give you one tip with relative positioning, only use it when you need to move elements on your page little tiny margins. Like you're now getting into doing like pixel perfect kind of lining everything up. Relative positioning is the perfect time for that, because you're moving it relative to its original position in document flow. Okay? Okay. Let's pop back into Dreamweaver, And we'll just remove those 4 rules that we just did. I just want to kind of reset us back to square one for our next positioning rule. All right, so absolute positioning is a lot like floats. Absolute position, when you absolutely position something, you're removing it from document flow. Okay, so what I'm going to do on element 1 is I'm going to use absolute positioning on it. Okay, so position and absolute. Okay, if you guys save that and preview it in your browser, you might be like, okay, I kind of get what's going on there. So this looks familiar, right? We've seen it work like this before. I see element 1 and element 3, but where's element 2? Well, because I removed it from document flow, 2 and 3 don't see it anymore. So they've moved up to occupy that space. All right? Again, when you absolutely position something or float it, you can actually, what you're doing is you're bringing it to the front. So things are allowed to tuck in behind it. It's allowed to overlap other elements. Okay? Element 2 is still there. It's just in behind element 1. We can't see it. So let's move element 1 so that we can see it. Okay? Let's go back to Dreamweaver. We'll apply some offset properties to element 1. Let's do top 125 pixels. And left 125 pixels. And prepare to have your mind blown. Hold on to something. Go ahead and save that. Go back out to your browser and refresh your page. I have a feeling that most of you think it's going to end up somewhere down here. Top and left, 125 pixels each. And refresh your page. And I'm guessing, like I said, I'm guessing you guys think it's going to be somewhere in here. Wow, what the heck, right? I assure you, that sounded really professor-like of me. Believe me, this is working exactly how it's supposed to work, okay? The offset values of top, bottom, left, and right work exactly the same for absolute positioning as they do for relative positioning. The only difference is, I guess, that the point of origin. Where is it getting that 125 and 125 from, okay? It's not from its relative position in document flow because I've removed it from flow with absolute positioning. Okay, if the terms ever start getting too much, I'll try to use layman's terms. So absolute positioning. Here's the key thing to absolute positioning. You remove it from document flow, and when you do that, what an absolutely positioned element does is it looks for the first parent element or container that has the position property applied to it. And that is where it gets positioned from. Okay, I'll try and illustrate that right now. So jump back to your code. Let me recite that just one more time. So an absolutely positioned element looks for the first parent container with a position attribute applied to it. Okay, scroll down into your HTML really quick. So here's our element that we removed from document flow and we positioned absolutely. Okay. So this element is saying, okay, I'm positioned absolute. So okay, div with the class of container. Do you have a position property applied to you? And if I look in my CSS, no, it does not. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going up the ladder. I'm speaking on behalf of element 1. Okay. All right. So what's my next parent container? Well, it's the body tag. Okay, so does the body tag have any positioning applied to it? So I scroll back up, and in my CSS, no, it does not. Okay, so what's it actually positioning itself to? Well, where's my body tag? Okay, sorry, it's my body tag. So it doesn't see any in the body tag. So what it actually does is it targets the HTML tag, which you can see way up. Here. Okay, so it's targeting your HTML tag. Okay, and it's positioning itself relative to that. So it's saying, all right, you're in the top left corner of the screen. which is also called the viewport. We're going to get into talking about the viewport when we do a lot of relative or responsive designs. So it's taking this point as the point of origin and moving it 125 pixels from the left and 125 pixels from the top. Okay. Now you can see here I've got a couple parent containers to this element still. This white box is the body tag, and this kind of tan ochre color is the container, the div with the class of container on it. And so what happens if I put a position attribute or a position rule onto one of those containers? So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do the body tag first. Okay. So back in your CSS, inside your declaration for the body tag, go ahead and put position relative. And why position relative? Well, remember when we did element 1 in the previous section, we did relative positioning. We put position relative on element 1 and we saved it and tested it. Nothing really happened, except that we then applied a position attribute to it. Okay? Visually, we don't see anything. But now we've changed the way that the page elements interact with each other. So go ahead and save this and preview it in your browser window and hit refresh. Okay? So now what's happening is that element 1 goes into this container, which is this first parent element, and it says, okay, do you have any positioning applied to you? No, it does not. Okay, so now I'm going to go up to the body tag, which is my next parent container. Do you have a position element applied to you? Yes, it does. So it's like, okay, thanks. I'm going to now use you to position myself 125 pixels from the top and 125 pixels from the left. Okay, so what happens if we were to apply a position attribute to the container div? Let's do that. So scroll down. Here's your container. Well, the class of container on that div. And let's give a position of relative to it and save it and then go back and test it in your browser. Great, so now element 1 is saying, okay, what's my first parent element, which is that div with the class of container on it. It says, okay, great, you've got a position element applied to you. I'm going to use you for positioning. Forget body. I don't even need to go up the ladder that high. I don't need to go to the HTML. I don't need to do that. So I'm just going to position myself 125 pixels from the top and 125 pixels from the left of the div with the container on it. Does that make sense to everybody? What was the one point that I wanted to make? Oh, right. So, okay, I taught this to myself, and I found that the best way to kind of learn this stuff was to look at other people's code and what it was doing and why it was doing it, what it was doing. And a lot of times when I saw people's CSS, I would see like, position relative. Okay, great. But I didn't apply any offsets to it. So I was sitting there thinking like, okay, why would you put position relative on something and then not move it? Okay. If you ever see an element with position relative on it and then it not being offset at all, automatically that should, like a light bulb should go off saying like, okay, somebody is using, whoever made this is using this element in order for a child element to position it, okay? Because it's probably got absolute positioning on it. So for the longest time that boggled me, like, why are people doing this? Like, it's so much extra work. If I were to take that off of that, if I were to take position relative off that container and position relative off the body, you could remember what happens. It's not even, element 1 is going to fly way off my page, okay? So keep that in mind whenever you're building pages or editing pages or looking at somebody else's code. If you see position relative on something and no offsets, you can kind of, I guess is the right word, that there's something is being absolutely positioned inside of that container. You guys have any questions about that? No? Okay. Thankfully, the last one is the easiest one. So let's go ahead and we'll remove what we did again. Go ahead and remove position relative off that container, position relative off the body tag. and position absolute off of element 1. Okay, and the last positioning rule I want to talk to you guys about is fixed positioning, okay? Which works a lot like absolute positioning in the matter that you also remove it from document flow. So everything is going to move up to occupy the space. I'm going to work with element 1 again, and I'm going to put position fixed on it. Position fixed. Okay. Now, position fixed, whenever you see that, you are going to see offset rules being applied to that top, bottom, left, or right. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a top of 25 pixels and a right of 25 pixels. We've been using top and left. Let's do top and right this time. 25 pixels, right, 25 pixels. Okay. So go ahead and save that, and then preview it in your browser. Okay, that's way over there. So unlike absolute positioning, fixed positioning is not looking for a parent container to see if it has a position element applied to it. It doesn't care what anything else on the page is doing. What you're literally doing is taking that element right out of document flow and you're positioning it relative to the viewport, so your screen. And to prove that, you can see here that we moved it 25 pixels from the top and 25 pixels from the right. Okay, so that's your 25 and your 25. But if I move my browser window, it's always going to be 25 pixels from the right. And so now I'm actually getting this thing where, this is pretty unfortunate. I don't want this to happen, right? So, but there's nothing really you can do. That's the way fixed positioning works. The only way you could do that is to prevent your browser or your site from collapsing. We're not going to get into that today. That's it. Fixed positioning is great because it's so simple. You literally, it does not care about anything else on your page. Remove it from document flow. You can see elements 2 and 3 now move up to occupy that space, and you can put it anywhere. You could do bottom 25, and it's going to be down here all the time, no matter how big your browser, I guess, your viewport is. That one's pretty simple. Thank God, right? Okay, that's it. Does anybody have any questions?